I never thought I'd be the type of woman who would invite her husband's mistress to dinner. But then again, I never thought my husband of 8 years would betray me with my wedding photographer. The night I served Marcus's favorite meal while his lover sat across from him, completely unaware of who I was, taught me more about myself than the entire decade we'd spent together. This is the story of how I discovered the affair, orchestrated the most uncomfortable dinner party in history, and ultimately found the strength to reclaim my life on my own terms. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Our life together seemed picture-perfect from the outside, the kind of marriage friends envied and family celebrated at every holiday gathering. Marcus and I had met during my final year of culinary school, when he walked into the restaurant where I was completing my internship. He was charming, confident, and seemed genuinely interested in my passion for creating experimental fusion cuisine. He proposed exactly 1 year later on the rooftop garden of that same restaurant, surrounded by herbs I had planted and nurtured throughout our relationship. The wedding was intimate but elegant. Just 50 of our closest friends and family gathered at a vineyard outside the city. That's where we met Sophia, the photographer Marcus had insisted on hiring after seeing her portfolio online. "Her work is extraordinary," he had said, showing me candid shots of couples looking genuinely happy, not posed or artificial. "She captures real emotions, not just smiles for the camera." I had agreed without hesitation. The photos were indeed breathtaking, and Sophia had a way of blending into the background, capturing moments so authentic you almost forgot someone was there with a camera. She delivered our wedding album 3 weeks later, a stunning collection of images that told the story of our day perfectly. Marcus had seemed particularly pleased with the results. 5 years into our marriage, we bought a charming craftsman-style home in a neighborhood just outside downtown. Marcus's architecture firm was thriving, and I had finally opened my own restaurant, Maison, which had quickly become one of the most talked-about dining spots in the city. We were busy, certainly, but we made time for each other. Date nights every Friday, weekend getaways every few months, and an annual trip abroad to explore new cuisines and cultures. Our routine was comfortable, predictable in the best way. Marcus would leave for work around 7, stopping by the kitchen to kiss me goodbye as I prepared breakfast. I would head to the restaurant by 9, spend the day developing new recipes and managing the staff, and return home around midnight. Despite our different schedules, we always found ways to connect. He would leave notes in my cookbook, and I would prepare meals for him to reheat when he got hungry late at night. "We're the perfect team," Marcus would say, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I cooked. The architect and the chef, we both create experiences that stay with people. I believed him. I believed in us. The thought that our foundation might not be as solid as the buildings he designed never crossed my mind. Not until last spring, when small inconsistencies began to appear in our carefully constructed life. It started with late nights at the office. Architecture had always demanded long hours, especially when deadlines loomed. But Marcus had begun returning home well past midnight several times a week. When I asked about the projects keeping him so busy, his answers were vague, missing the passionate details he usually shared about his designs. "Just the usual client demands?" he would say, loosening his tie and pouring himself a glass of bourbon. "Nothing worth boring you with." But Marcus had never found his work boring, and he'd certainly never thought I would find it so. We had spent countless evenings with him sketching concepts at the kitchen counter while I prepared dinner, both of us offering input on the other's creative process. Then came the business trips, weekend workshops and client meetings in cities just far, enough away to require overnight stays. These had never been frequent before, but suddenly they filled our calendar. "The firm is expanding," he explained when I mentioned the change. "We're taking on more regional projects. It's good for us, Rebecca. These connections will secure our future. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? Marcus had never given me reason to doubt his word, and his firm was indeed growing. I'd attended their holiday party just months earlier, listened to the partners announce ambitious plans for the new year. It made sense that these plans would require more of his time. Yet something felt off in a way I couldn't articulate. The distance between us wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. Our conversations grew shorter, less substantial. When we did spend time together, Marcus seemed distracted, checking his phone more frequently than usual, smiling at messages he wouldn't share. "Work never stops," he would say, when I asked who was texting so late at night. "Johnson needs these revisions by morning." I pushed my concerns aside, focusing instead on my restaurant. Maison had recently received a glowing review in the city's most prestigious publication, and reservations were booked solid for months. The validation of my culinary vision was everything I'd worked for, and the demands of success kept me too busy to dwell on the subtle shifts in my marriage. Until one evening in April, when everything changed. The restaurant was closed on Mondays, my one reliable day off each week. Usually, I spent the morning sleeping in, then treated myself to an afternoon of experimenting with new recipes in our home kitchen. But that Monday, I woke early, inspired by a dream about a saffron-infused seafood dish I wanted to develop for the summer menu. I needed specific spices that I kept only at the restaurant, so I drove downtown, enjoying the rare quiet of a Monday morning in the city. The restaurant was dark and peaceful as I unlocked the door. I moved through the dining room toward the kitchen, but stopped when I noticed Marcus's leather portfolio on one of the tables. He must have left it the last time he'd come for dinner, I thought, picking it up. Inside were the usual items: his business cards, a small notebook, sketches on graph paper, and an envelope I didn't recognize. I hesitated only briefly before opening it. Inside was a collection of photographs, not the architectural documentation I expected, but intimate portraits of a woman in various settings. Some were artistic black and white compositions, others candid color shots capturing laughter and subtle glances. With a sinking feeling, I recognized Sophia, our wedding photographer, and in several images, partially obscured but unmistakable, was Marcus, his hand on her waist, his profile as he leaned toward her. The most recent photo, dated just 2 weeks earlier, showed them at a hotel I recognized, in the city where Marcus had supposedly attended a design conference. They were on a balcony, champagne glasses raised toward the camera, the intimate selfie of a couple celebrating. My hands trembled as I returned the photos to the envelope. A cold numbness spread through me, followed by waves of nausea and anger that left me gripping the edge of the table for support. 8 years of marriage, and I'd never once suspected. How could I have been so blind? I don't know how long I sat there, the portfolio open before me, my mind racing through every late night, every business trip, every distracted conversation of the past months. All the small inconsistencies suddenly aligned into a clear and devastating picture. But as the initial shock began to recede, something unexpected happened. Beneath the hurt and betrayal, I felt a strange, calm clarity emerging. I didn't want to confront Marcus in a tearful rage. I didn't want to call Sophia and scream accusations. I wanted something more satisfying, something that would force both of them to face the reality of their deception. That's when the idea came to me, audacious and possibly insane, but somehow perfect. I would invite Sophia to dinner, not just any dinner, but an intimate chef's table experience at Maison. I would serve them the most exquisite meal of my career, with my husband and his mistress as the unsuspecting guests of honor. As I drove home, the plan crystallized in my mind. I wouldn't be the devastated wife, collapsed in grief. I would be the architect of their reckoning, calm, controlled, and completely in command of the evening that would change everything. Returned home that Monday afternoon with the leather portfolio tucked under my arm, my mind spinning with possibilities. The house was empty. Marcus wouldn't be home until late, as usual. I placed the portfolio exactly where he'd left it last weekend, on the console table in the hallway. Let him believe it had been there all along. Let him feel secure in his deception, while I planned my response. That night, I prepared dinner as if nothing had changed. Pan-seared duck breast with a cherry reduction, his favorite. I set the table with our best china, opened a bottle of Bordeaux we'd been saving, and waited. When he finally arrived just after 10, surprise registered on his face. "What's the occasion?" he asked, setting down his briefcase and loosening his tie. "No occasion," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "I just had some free time and thought you deserved something special." He kissed my cheek, a gesture that once would have warmed me but now felt hollow. As we ate, I studied him. This man I'd shared my life with for nearly a decade. How many lies had passed through those lips? How many times had he looked at me with those blue eyes and told me he was working late when he was actually with her? "This is incredible," he said, savoring the duck. "You've outdone yourself." "Thank you," I smiled, raising my glass. "To us." He met my toast with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "To us." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Throughout dinner, I carefully guided our conversation toward his work, watching for the tells I now knew to look for. Sure enough, when I asked about the Robertson project, a commercial complex he'd mentioned was taking up most of his time, his eyes shifted slightly to the left, and he took a sip of wine before answering. "It's coming along. The client is particular, but we're making progress." "And Sophia? Has she taken the photos of the model yet?" I asked casually, as if inquiring about any of the contractors his firm regularly worked with. His fork paused midway, to his mouth, just for a second, so brief anyone else might have missed it. But I saw the momentary freeze, the quick recalibration. "Sophia? Your photographer. You mentioned she might document the project for your portfolio." Another lie I was testing. He'd never mentioned any such thing. "Oh, right," he recovered smoothly. "Not yet. We're still finalizing the model before any documentation." I nodded, taking a slow sip of wine. Every word out of his mouth confirmed what I already knew. I'd been married to a stranger all along. A talented liar who could fabricate details on the spot without hesitation. "I was thinking," I said as I served dessert, a dark chocolate soufflé with Grand Marnier. "We should host a dinner party soon. It's been ages since we entertained. Maybe invite some of your colleagues from the firm." Marcus looked relieved at the change of subject. "That would be nice, though you know how busy the restaurant keeps you." "I'll make time," I insisted. In fact, I was thinking of doing something special at Maison, a private chef's table event. You could invite some of your important clients, make it a networking opportunity. His eyes lit up at this. I knew they would. Marcus never passed up. A chance to impress clients with his connections, and having a wife who owned one of the city's most celebrated restaurants had always been a point of pride for him. "That's actually a brilliant idea," he said. "The Robertson team would love it." "Perfect. Why don't you handle the guest list? 6 to 8 people would be ideal. I'll take care of everything else." He agreed enthusiastically, already pulling out his phone, presumably to message his clients. I wondered if Sophia would be among them. I was counting on it. After dinner, while Marcus showered, I took the opportunity to check his phone. In the early years of our marriage, I would have considered this a breach of trust, an unforgivable invasion of privacy. Now it felt like a necessary investigation into the life he'd been hiding from me. His password hadn't changed. My birthday, ironically enough. I quickly found what I was looking for in his message history. Conversations with S that spanned months, filled with intimate exchanges, planning for their meetings, references to their time together, photos I forced myself to scroll past quickly. And most recently, his excitement about the dinner at Maison, chef's table at Rebecca's restaurant, private event. You have to come, say you're documenting it for my portfolio. It'll be the highlight of the season, and no one does fusion like Rebecca. Besides, it's time you tasted my wife's cooking. My stomach twisted at his casual cruelty, the way he spoke of me as merely a chef whose talents could entertain his lover. But beneath the pain, my resolve strengthened. This was exactly what I'd hoped for. He was playing right into my hands. I returned his phone to the nightstand just as the shower turned off. When he came to bed, I pretended to be asleep, unable to bear his touch. Morning couldn't come quickly. Enough. The next few days passed in a haze of meticulous planning. At Maison, I told my staff we'd be hosting a special private event the following week. An exclusive chef's table experience for some of my husband's important clients. I selected my most trusted team members for service that night and began developing a menu that would showcase every culinary skill I possessed. Each dish would tell a story, our story, though only I would know the full meaning behind the carefully crafted courses. The amuse-bouche would represent our beginning, the first meeting at the restaurant where I'd interned. The appetizer would symbolize our courtship and wedding day. Each subsequent course would mark a significant moment in our relationship, culminating in a dessert that would signify the end, bitter and sweet, complex and final. Meanwhile, I watched Marcus with newly awakened eyes. Now that I knew what to look for, his deception was painfully obvious. The way he always placed his phone face down, how he took calls in another room, the subtle change in his cologne, the late-night showers before coming to bed. 100 little betrayals I'd overlooked or rationalized away. I also began researching Sophia more thoroughly. Her professional website featured an impressive portfolio, architectural documentation, events, portraits. Under weddings, I found our own photos prominently displayed. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had captured our vows was now party to breaking them. Her Instagram revealed more. A successful career, a sleek downtown apartment, travel photos from exotic locations, some with Marcus half-cropped, out or photographed from behind, his identity concealed yet obvious to anyone who knew him well. How many of those trips had been business conferences or client meetings he'd told me about? I found myself wondering about her. Did she know he was still married? Did she think we were separated? Or was she fully aware and simply didn't care? The photos from his portfolio suggested an ongoing affair of at least 6 months, possibly longer. I tried to remember when he had first mentioned her name again, after our wedding. Had he maintained contact all these years? Or had they reconnected more recently? It didn't matter, I told myself. The timeline of their betrayal wouldn't change what I planned to do. 4 days before the dinner, Marcus confirmed the guest list. 2 actual clients from the Robertson project, his business partner Thomas and his wife, and Sophia, whom he introduced in his email as the photographer who'll be documenting the evening for the firm's marketing materials. I forwarded the list to my restaurant manager with specific instructions for the seating arrangement. Sophia would be placed directly across from me, where I could observe her every reaction. That same day, I visited my attorney, Sarah, an old friend from college who had her own practice specializing in family law. I didn't share the full extent of my plan, but I did bring copies of the photographs and evidence of Marcus's affair. I'm not ready to file yet, I explained as she reviewed the materials, her expression growing increasingly concerned. But I want to understand my options. Rebecca, she said gently, with evidence this clear, you're in a strong position. Michigan is a no-fault state for divorce, but adultery can still impact property division and spousal support, especially given The duration of your marriage and the fact that your restaurant grew during this time. I nodded, absorbing the information without emotion. I also need to protect Maison. The restaurant is solely in my name, but we've used joint funds for some expenses over the years. We can work on that, Sarah assured me, making notes. I'll prepare the preliminary paperwork so we can move quickly when you're ready. Just say the word. As I left her office, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. I was no longer just reacting to Marcus's betrayal. I was taking control, protecting what I'd built, preparing for whatever came next. The night before the dinner, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake beside Marcus, listening to his even breathing, wondering how he could rest so peacefully while living such a divided life. Did he ever feel guilt? Regret? Or had he compartmentalized so effectively that his life with me and his life with Sophia existed in entirely separate mental spaces, neither intruding upon the other? In the darkness, I rehearsed the evening to come, every dish, every word, every reveal. I had no idea how it would end, only that by dessert, nothing would ever be the same. As dawn broke, I slipped out of bed and headed to Maison. I had dinner to prepare, the most important service of my career. The morning of the dinner, Maison hummed with focused energy. I arrived at dawn, hours before my staff, needing the solitude to center myself. The empty restaurant had always been my sanctuary, the quiet before service, when possibilities hung in the air like the lingering sense of last night's final course. Today, that sanctuary felt different. As I moved through the kitchen, gathering ingredients and reviewing my meticulously planned menu, each action felt weighted with purpose beyond the culinary. Today's preparation wasn't just about food, it was about justice, revelation, perhaps even closure. My sous chef, Eliza, arrived at 8, followed shortly by the rest of my hand-picked team. They sensed something significant about tonight's event, though none knew the true nature of what would unfold. Eliza, who had been with me since we'd opened Maison, studied my face with concern. "Everything all right, chef? You seem intense this morning." I managed a smile. "Just want tonight to be perfect. It's important to Marcus." She nodded, though her eyes held questions she was too professional to ask. That was the beauty of kitchen hierarchy. In this domain, my word was law, my privacy, respected. Unlike my marriage, where privacy had become a weapon wielded against me. By noon, the prep was well underway, stocks simmering, sauces reducing, delicate components being assembled with surgical precision. I focused on the amuse-bouche, tiny works of art that would begin the narrative of the evening. Seared scallops with citrus foam and a micro-herb garnish, reminiscent of the first dish I'd ever served Marcus. "Remember what I said about this dish?" He had asked on our third date, after taking me to dinner at the restaurant where we'd met. That the chef understood balance, I'd replied, pleased he'd noticed the careful interplay of flavors. Exactly. Sweet, acidic, savory, all in perfect harmony. He'd reached for my hand then, his touch electric. Like us. Now, 8 years later, I infused that same dish with new meaning. The balance remained, but I'd added a hidden element, a subtle bitterness that would only register after the initial sweetness faded. Just like our marriage. As service time approached, I stepped away to change into my chef's whites, freshly pressed and spotless. In the small office bathroom, I studied my reflection. The woman staring back at me looked composed, professional, betraying none of the turmoil beneath. I applied a light touch of makeup, something I rarely bothered with for regular service, and pulled my dark hair into a tight, neat bun. Tonight, I needed to be flawless, unreadable, in control. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Everyone confirmed. We'll be there at 7:30. Can't wait. This means a lot to me." I didn't doubt that. This dinner would secure important clients, impress his business partner, and allow him to show off both his successful wife and his mistress in the same room. A perverse thrill I imagined he couldn't resist. The audacity still astounded me. Did he think me so oblivious? Or did he simply not care if I discovered the truth? At 7, I gathered my staff for final instructions. The private dining room was set perfectly. Crisp white linens, gleaming silverware, crystal that caught the soft lighting and scattered it like stars across the table. Place cards marked each setting according to my careful arrangement. A separate small table had been positioned in the corner for Sophia's photography equipment, a considerate touch suggested by Marcus, who had no idea how perfectly it served my purposes. "Tonight is special," I told my team. "These guests are important to my husband, which makes them important to Maison. I want flawless execution, impeccable timing, nothing less than perfection." They nodded in unison, ready for the challenge. In the kitchen, we moved with practiced precision, every step choreographed like a dance we'd performed 1,000 times before. The familiar rhythm steadied me, quieted the voice in my head that questioned whether I was going too far, whether this elaborately staged evening was madness rather than justice. At precisely 7:25, the hostess informed me that the first guests had arrived. The Robertsons, the actual clients Marcus had mentioned. I stayed in the kitchen, watching through the pass as they were seated, champagne already poured and waiting. Thomas and his wife arrived next, followed shortly by Marcus. My husband looked handsome in his tailored charcoal suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, his smile confident as he greeted his clients and business partner. To anyone else, he would appear to be exactly what he claimed, a successful architect hosting an impressive business dinner. Only I knew the performance he was putting on, the double life he was juggling with such practiced ease. At 7:40, the final guest arrived. Through the kitchen window, I watched Sophia enter carrying a sleek camera bag and a smaller equipment case. She was striking, tall and graceful with honey blonde hair that fell in loose waves past her shoulders. She wore a simple black dress that hugged her slender frame, professional yet unmistakably elegant. I could see why Marcus had been drawn to her, though the thought brought no comfort. Marcus greeted her with a carefully modulated enthusiasm, friendly but not too familiar, a business acquaintance rather than a lover. Only the briefest touch of his hand at the small of her back as he guided her to her seat betrayed a deeper connection, a gesture so subtle that no one else would notice. But I did. I noticed everything now. The hostess escorted Sophia to her designated place, directly across from where I would sit when I joined them after the main course, as planned. Marcus took his seat at the head of the table, the position of power. If he found it odd that his wife would eventually be seated at the opposite end, with his mistress between them, he gave no indication. I signaled to the servers to begin. The tiquoau. Amuse-bouche was presented with a flourish, accompanied by a sommelier pouring the first wine pairing, a crisp Sancerre that complemented the delicate scallop perfectly. Through the pass, I watched the guests' reactions. The clients and Thomas's wife exclaimed in delight. Thomas, who had dined at Maison many times, nodded appreciatively. Marcus beamed with pride, accepting compliments for his wife's culinary prowess. And Sophia? She seemed genuinely impressed, taking a small, precise bite, then reaching for her camera to document the dish. Did she know she was photographing food prepared by her lover's wife? Did she care? The questions burned inside me as I turned back to the kitchen to supervise the plating of the first course. As each meticulously crafted dish made its way to the table, I monitored the diners' reactions, particularly Sophia's. She alternated between photographing the food and engaging in conversation, primarily with the clients seated beside her. She and Marcus maintained a careful distance, their interactions limited to discussing the architectural merit of various photos she'd taken. To any observer, they were consummate professionals, nothing more. But I caught the lingering glances, the way her smile changed subtly when addressing him. the manner in which he leaned slightly toward her when she spoke. The signs were there for anyone looking closely enough. And I was looking very closely indeed. The third course, a deconstructed bouillabaisse that represented our honeymoon in southern France, was being served when I noticed Sophia excuse herself, camera in hand. She moved through the restaurant, presumably taking atmospheric shots of the space. This was my opportunity. I slipped out of the kitchen and intercepted her near the main dining room, which was closed for regular service tonight. "The lighting in here is particularly good for evening shots," I said, approaching her with a professional smile. "I'm Rebecca. By the way, the chef." She turned, momentarily startled, then composed herself. "Sophia Chen. I'm documenting the evening for Marcus's firm." She extended her hand, which I took, noting how soft her skin was, how delicate her fingers. The hands that had touched my husband were touched by him in return. "Marcus mentioned you'd be joining us. He speaks very highly of your work." Something flickered in her eyes. Pleasure, perhaps, or caution. "That's kind of him. I've worked with his firm on several projects now." "Including our wedding," I added, casually, maintaining my smile. "You were our photographer, remember? 8 years ago at Vineyard Vale." Recognition dawned on her face, followed immediately by what seemed like genuine surprise. "Oh, yes, of course. I'm sorry, I didn't connect." She paused, recalibrating. "That was one of my first major weddings. Your dress was stunning. That vintage lace overlay." I nodded, impressed despite myself at her recall of details. "You captured the day beautifully. We still have those photos displayed in our home." An uncomfortable silence settled between us. I watched emotions play across her face. Confusion, realization, perhaps even guilt. Good. Let her feel the weight of what she'd been participating in. "I should get back to the kitchen," I said finally. "Enjoy the rest of your meal. I'll be joining you after the main course." I turned away before she could respond, my heart pounding but my exterior calm. The first direct contact had been made, the first seed of awareness planted. I imagined her returning to the table, looking at Marcus with new understanding, perhaps wondering what game he was playing by bringing her here, to his wife's restaurant. Back in the kitchen, Eliza shot me a questioning look. "Everything okay?" "Perfect," I replied, checking the rack of lamb for the main course. "Everything is proceeding exactly as planned." As I supervised the plating for the fourth course, I wondered what was happening at the table now. Has Sophia's demeanor changed? Had she given any indication to Marcus that she'd spoken with me? Was she connecting the dots, realizing she wasn't just the photographer for this dinner, but an unwitting participant in something much more complex? I would find out soon enough. After the main course, I would make my entrance, take my place at the table, and begin the final act of this carefully orchestrated evening. The time for shadows and silence was almost over. Soon, everything would be illuminated, every lie, every betrayal exposed to the harsh light of truth. The main course, rack of lamb with rosemary-infused jus, accompanied by seasonal vegetables, and truffle mashed potatoes, was the most technically challenging dish of the evening. It represented the height of our marriage, those middle years when everything seemed secure and established. The lamb, perfectly cooked, a beautiful rose-pink center. The exterior, charred and seasoned to perfection, much like our life together, had appeared on the surface, flawless, enviable, masking what lay beneath. As the servers presented the dish to appreciative murmurs from the guests, I stepped back from the past to change. My chef's whites, though immaculate, wouldn't do for the next phase of the evening. In my office, I slipped into the burgundy silk dress I'd brought for the occasion, elegant but understated, professional enough for a chef greeting special guests, yet refined enough to remind everyone, especially Marcus, that I was more than just the woman behind their meal. I refreshed my makeup, adding a touch more color to my lips, and released my hair from its tight bun, letting it fall in soft waves around my shoulders. The woman in the mirror looked confident, almost serene, betraying none of the turmoil within. Good. Tonight was about control, about reclaiming the narrative that Marcus had distorted for so long. Before returning to the dining room, I checked my phone. A text from Sarah, my attorney. Documents ready when you need them. Call me anytime. I slipped the phone into my clutch along with a small USB drive containing copies of the evidence I'd gathered. Everything was in place. I paused at the kitchen door, taking a deep breath. Dessert service in 30 minutes, I instructed Eliza. Text me when it's ready to plate. She nodded, curiosity evident in her eyes, but professionalism keeping her questions at bay. Yes, chef. Everything is prepared. And waiting. With another steadying breath, I pushed through the door and made my entrance into the private dining room. Conversation halted as heads turned toward me. Marcus rose to his feet, his smile warm and proud, the devoted husband welcoming his talented wife. And here she is, he announced, gesturing grandly. The creative genius behind tonight's extraordinary meal. The clients applauded. Thomas raised his wine glass in salute, and his wife beamed at me. Only Sophia's reaction interested me. Truly. She had frozen, her camera halfway to her face, her expression a complex mixture of recognition, confusion, and what might have been the first flickers of understanding. Thank you all for coming, I said, moving to take my designated seat at the opposite end of the table from Marcus, with Sophia now positioned perfectly between us. I hope you've enjoyed the journey so far. It's been incredible, Mrs. Robertson gushed. Each course is more impressive than the last. Rebecca has always had a gift for telling stories through food, Marcus said, his voice warm with what anyone else would interpret as genuine affection. Every element on the plate has meaning, I smiled, meeting his gaze directly. Indeed. Tonight's menu is particularly special, a culinary journey through significant moments. Oh? Thomas's wife leaned forward eagerly. Would you mind sharing the inspiration behind each course? I've always been fascinated by the creative process. This was my opening, the moment I'd been waiting for. Of course, I replied, reaching for my wine glass. The amuse-bouche represented beginnings. Specifically, the first dish I ever served to Marcus when we met at Bellini's, where I was interning. The scallop, delicate yet assertive, caught his attention immediately. Marcus nodded, his expression nostalgic. I knew from that first bite I had to know the chef. The first course, I continued, with its contrasting textures and temperatures, symbolized our courtship. The excitement, the discovery, the balance we found in each other. I turned slightly toward Sophia, who was watching me with increasing discomfort. The second course drew inspiration from our wedding day. The celebration of a union meant to last a lifetime, captured so beautifully by the photographer present. Sophia's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. Marcus's smile remained fixed, but I noticed a new tension in his jaw, a slight narrowing of his eyes as he began to sense the direction of my narrative. The bouillabaisse, I went on, recalled our honeymoon in Marseille, the merging of separate elements into a harmonious whole. And the lamb we've just enjoyed represents the solid foundation we built together. Impressive from the outside, perfectly executed. I paused, taking a deliberate sip of wine. Dessert, when it arrives, will complete our story. Its rather unexpected finale. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. The clients, oblivious to the undercurrents, smiled appreciatively. Thomas, more perceptive, glanced between Marcus and me with growing awareness that something beyond a simple business dinner was unfolding. Marcus cleared his throat. Rebecca has always had a flair for the dramatic, he said, attempting to lighten the mood. It's one of the things I love most about her. Is it? I asked quietly. I thought you preferred simplicity these days, something less complicated. His smile faltered for just a second before he recovered. In architecture, perhaps. In cuisine, I value your creative complexity. Fascinating, I murmured, turning to address one of the clients. Mr. Robertson, Marcus tells me your project is making excellent progress. He's been working such long hours, often not home until well past midnight. Mr. Robertson looked surprised. Really? We've been keeping regular hours on this one. Nothing that should keep anyone past 7 or 8. At the latest. I feigned confusion. How strange. Perhaps I've misunderstood. Marcus, you mentioned heading to their site last Friday morning, didn't you? For that emergency consultation? Robertson looked even more confused. We didn't have any emergency last week. Everything's been on schedule. Marcus's composure slipped further, a flash of panic crossing his features before he forced another smile. Rebecca's confusing it with the Wellington project. Easy to mix up when I'm juggling so many clients. Of course, I nodded, all innocence. My mistake. It's hard to keep track sometimes when you're so busy. I turned my attention to Sophia, who had remained silent, her camera now resting unused beside her plate. I'm curious about your work. Sophia, how long have you been collaborating with Marcus's firm? She swallowed visibly before answering. About 6 months officially, though we've known each other longer. 8 years, I clarified with a smile. Since our wedding. Though I don't recall seeing your name on any of the firm's previous projects. Is architectural photography a recent specialization for you? Relatively, she managed, her voice strained. I've always done a mix of work, weddings, events, commercials. And personal photography? I asked mildly. Intimate portraits, that sort of thing? Marcus coughed suddenly, nearly choking on his wine. Perhaps we should discuss the actual Robertson project, he suggested, his voice tight. Since they're our guests of honor tonight. Of course, I agreed smoothly. Though I'm equally interested in all your work, Marcus. Every project, every collaboration, every creative partnership. The tension at the table was now palpable. Thomas was watching Marcus with growing suspicion. His wife looked uncomfortable, and the Robertsons seemed increasingly confused by the strange undercurrents. Sophia stared fixedly at her plate, her cheeks flushed. My phone vibrated silently in my clutch, Eliza's signal that dessert was ready. Perfect timing. If you'll excuse me for just a moment, I said, rising gracefully. I need to oversee the final course. Please, continue enjoying your wine. In the kitchen, I found the desserts already plated. Individual dark chocolate soufflés, rising magnificently from their ramekins, accompanied by a bitter orange sauce and a delicate sugar sculpture that resembled shattered glass. The finishing touch waited on a small tray. 6 envelopes, 1 for each guest. What are those? Eliza asked as I arranged them beside each dessert plate. The final ingredient, I replied cryptically. Essential to the complete experience. When I returned to the dining room, Marcus was engaged in animated conversation with the clients, clearly trying to steer the evening back to safer ground. Sophia remained silent, her eyes meeting mine briefly before darting away. She knew. Perhaps not everything, but enough to understand she'd been lured into something far more complex than a simple business dinner. The servers placed the desserts with practiced precision, each plate perfectly aligned, each envelope positioned just so. I resumed my seat, watching as the guests admired the presentation. Before we enjoy the final course, I announced, I've included a small accompaniment that adds crucial context to tonight's experience. Please, open your envelopes. Marcus reached for him with visible trepidation. Sophia's hand trembled as she picked up hers. The others, still unaware of the drama unfolding, opened theirs with simple curiosity. Inside each envelope was a single photograph, different for each guest. The Robertsons received images of Marcus and Sophia entering a hotel together, his hand possessively at her waist. Thomas and his wife found pictures of intimate dinners, stolen kisses in what Marcus had claimed was his private office at the firm. Sophia's envelope contained the most damning image of all: Marcus placing a key in her palm, date-stamped the day he had claimed to be visiting his mother in Philadelphia. The key to our vacation home, I had discovered, which he had given her free access to during our busy seasons when I was most occupied with the restaurant. And Marcus? His envelope held a different kind of document. The first page of divorce papers, already signed by me, with a post-it note reading simply, "Dessert is served." The expressions around the table transformed in rapid succession: shock, confusion, realization, horror. Mr. Robertson set down his photo, his face flushing with embarrassment. His wife gasped audibly. Thomas looked from the image in his hand to Marcus with undisguised disgust. Sophia went pale, then red, her eyes filling with tears as she stared at the key in the photograph, evidence that couldn't be explained away. And Marcus, my husband of 8 years, the man I had built a life with, trusted, loved, looked as though the ground had opened beneath him. His hands shook as he stared at the divorce papers, then raised his eyes to meet mine. "Rebecca," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "This isn't... What does it look like?" I finished for him, my voice steady and clear. "I think we both know exactly what this is, Marcus. I think everyone at this table now knows precisely what kind of man you are." The soufflés sat untouched, beginning their inevitable collapse, a fitting metaphor for the disintegration of the carefully constructed facade before me. The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. 6 people frozen in a tableau of revelation, the exquisite desserts forgotten as the far more potent truth was digested. I waited, my hands clasped calmly on the table before me, watching as the full impact of what I'd orchestrated rippled through the room. Mrs. Robertson was the first to react. She set down her photograph with trembling fingers and stood abruptly. "We should go," she murmured to her husband, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Mr. Robertson nodded, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Marcus, I think we'll need to reconsider our arrangement with your firm." He turned to me, clearly struggling to find appropriate words. "Rebecca, the meal was exceptional. Thank you for your hospitality." I inclined my head, slightly, acknowledging his awkward gratitude with grace. "Thank you for coming. I'm sorry your evening included unexpected elements." The Robertsons gathered their belongings and made a hasty exit, the door closing behind them with a soft click that seemed to break whatever spell had held the remaining guests immobile. Thomas cleared his throat, his gaze hard as he stared at Marcus. "You've jeopardized the entire Robertson contract, not to mention the reputation of our firm." He turned to his wife. "We should leave as well." His wife nodded, her expression a mixture of sympathy and discomfort as she glanced at me. "Rebecca, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." "No one did," I assured her. That was rather the point. As Thomas and his wife prepared to depart, he paused beside Marcus's chair. "We'll discuss this tomorrow at the office, 9 sharp." His tone left no room for negotiation. "And don't expect it to be pleasant." The door closed behind them, leaving just the 3 of us, the husband, the wife, and the mistress, finally confronting one another without pretense. Sophia was the picture of mortification, her cheeks flushed, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. She clutched her envelope, knuckling white with tension. "I should go," she whispered, reaching for her camera bag. "Stay," I said firmly. "Not a request, a command. You've earned your place at this table, Sophia. You should hear how the story ends." Marcus had not moved since opening his envelope, the divorce papers still clutched in his hand. Now he looked up, his face ashen. "Rebecca, please, let me explain." "Explain?" I repeated, the first hint of genuine emotion cracking through my composed exterior. What exactly would you like to explain, Marcus? How have you been sleeping with our wedding photographer? How have you been lying to me for months about your whereabouts? How did you give her access to our vacation home, the one your parents left you, the one we renovated together? He flinched at each question, each direct hit landing precisely as intended. I trusted you, I continued, my voice lower now, controlled but vibrating with intensity. I built a life with you. I supported your career, celebrated your successes, comforted you through failures, and all the while, you were building a parallel life with her. Sophia made a small, strangled sound. He told me you were separated, she said, her voice barely audible. He said you lived separate lives, that the marriage was over and everything, but paperwork. I turned to her, one eyebrow raised. And you believed him? Despite seeing me here tonight, despite recognizing me as the bride from the wedding you photographed? At what point did the narrative stop making sense to you, Sophia? She had no answer, her gaze dropping to the table in shame. The photographs in your portfolio, I continued. The ones from our wedding. Did you ever feel a twinge of conscience when you looked at them? When you captured the moment we exchanged vows? Did you imagine you'd be the one to help him break them? That's enough, Marcus interrupted, some of his color returning as he shifted from shocked victim to defensive participant. This isn't Sophia's fault. I pursued her. I lied to her about the state of our marriage. How gallant, I remarked, my tone ice cold. Defending your mistress at last. Tell me, did you lie to her about everything? Or just the inconvenient parts, like having a wife who believed you were faithful? He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd seen countless times during our marriage. It wasn't planned. It just happened. We reconnected when the firm hired her for the Westford project. One thing led to another. Things don't just happen, Marcus, I said, unable to keep the contempt from my voice. Affairs are built of choices, thousands of small, deliberate decisions to betray the person who trusts you most. I turned back to Sophia, who sat rigid with discomfort. When did you realize I wasn't just the chef tonight? That I was his wife? She swallowed hard. When you mentioned the wedding, but I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe you didn't know about us, that you were just being friendly because I'd photographed your wedding. And later, when I specifically mentioned being the photographer present during my narrative about the courses, I knew then that you knew, she admitted, a tear finally spilling down her cheek. But by then it was too late. I was trapped. Trapped, I echoed. An interesting choice of word. I've felt rather trapped myself these past few months. Trapped in a marriage built on lies. Trapped with a husband who came home late smelling of another woman's perfume, who took mysterious business trips, who slowly pulled away while I made excuses for his absence. Marcus leaned forward, desperation evident in every line of his body. Rebecca, I know I've hurt you terribly. But 8 years, doesn't that count for something? We can work through this. I'll end it with Sophia. I'll do whatever it takes. End it? I interrupted, genuinely surprised. You still think there's something to salvage here? After everything you've done? I made a mistake? A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or burning dinner, I cut in sharply. What you did was a systematic betrayal that lasted months. You didn't just cheat on me, Marcus. You constructed an elaborate double life. You lied to my face day after day. You used our resources, money from our joint accounts, to fund your affair. I reached into my clutch and removed the USB drive, placing it deliberately on the table between us. I have the receipts, hotel charges, dinners at restaurants we used to visit together, jewelry purchases that never made their way to me, all from our shared accounts. His face drained of color again as he recognized the implications. Not just adultery, but financial misconduct that would significantly impact our divorce proceedings. How long have you known? He asked, his voice hollow. Long enough to gather everything I needed, I replied. Long enough to consult with my attorney and understand exactly where I stand legally. Long enough to plan this evening down to the last detail. Sophia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I should go, she said again, gathering her camera with trembling hands. Before you leave, I said, I want you to know something. I don't blame you entirely. Marcus is remarkably convincing when he wants something. His charm, his apparent sincerity, they're quite compelling. I fell for it too, once. She looked at me, surprised by this unexpected moment of understanding. But, I continued, my voice hardening, you knew he was married. On some level, you knew you were participating in something destructive, and you chose to continue anyway. I loved him, she whispered, as if this explained everything. So did I replied simply. The difference is, I had a right to. Sophia stood, collecting her equipment with unsteady movements. I'm sorry, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. Truly. As she reached the door, I called after her. Sophia? The key to the lake house. Leave it with the hostess on your way out. She nodded, her shoulders slumped in defeat, and slipped out of the room, leaving Marcus and me truly alone for the first time since my discovery. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other across the table, the collapsed soufflés between us a fitting metaphor for our marriage. 8 years reduced to ashes in an evening. Was any of it real? I finally asked the question that had haunted me since finding the photographs. Us, our marriage. Did you ever actually love me? Something broke in Marcus's expression, the carefully maintained facade of control finally crumbling completely. Of course I loved you. I still love you. This thing with Sophia, it wasn't about not loving you. Then what was it about? I demanded. Boredom? Entitlement? The thrill of getting away with something? He shook his head, struggling to articulate. Something even he didn't seem to fully understand. I don't know. Maybe all of those things. You were so focused on the restaurant, always working late, passionate about building your brand. I felt sidelined, unimportant. So this is my fault? My success drove you to infidelity? The anger I'd been suppressing all evening flared hot and bright. I built this restaurant while supporting your career, Marcus. I cheered at every promotion, listened to every work story, massaged your ego when clients were difficult. Don't you dare blame my success for your weakness. That's not what I meant, he protested, but the damage was done. I could see the calculation. In his eyes, the attempt to shift blame that revealed his true character more clearly than any confession could have. I think we're finished here, I said, standing abruptly. The divorce papers are already filed. My attorney will contact yours. Tomorrow. Marcus stood as well, panic replacing his defensive posture. Rebecca, please. This dinner, these photos, you've made your point, but we can move past this. Couples recover from affairs all the time. We could try counseling. No, I said firmly, the single syllable carrying the weight of absolute certainty. There's nothing to recover, Marcus. What we had is dead. You killed it, methodically and deliberately, every time you chose her over me. Every lie you told, every moment you pretended to be the husband I thought you were. I gathered my clutch, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the evening was receding, leaving in its wake a bone-deep weariness. You should go, I told him, moving toward the door. The staff will see you out. What about the house? Our things? He asked, the practical concerns of separation already intruding on the emotional wreckage. My attorney will be in touch about the division of assets, I replied. But I think you'll find I've been quite generous in my initial proposal. I don't want a protracted legal battle, Marcus. I just want this finished. He stared at me, seeming to finally grasp the finality of what had happened. So that's it? 8 years ends like this? A public humiliation and divorce papers served with dessert? I paused at the door, turning back to face him one last time. You're right. 8 years deserved a better ending. You should have thought of that before you started sleeping with our wedding photographer. Without waiting for his response, I walked out, leaving him alone with the remnants of our marriage and the irrefutable evidence of its destruction. In the kitchen, my staff was cleaning up, the dinner service concluded. They watched me with concerned eyes as I passed through, but no one dared ask about the commotion they must have heard from the private dining room. Only Eliza approached, her expression sympathetic but not pitying. Chef, are you all right? I considered the question carefully. Was I all right? No, not yet, but I would be. I'm fine, I told her, with more conviction than I actually felt. The dinner went exactly as planned. The restaurant was quiet when I finally left, long after midnight. The staff had gone home, the kitchen spotless, ready for tomorrow's service as if nothing extraordinary had happened. As if I hadn't just dismantled my marriage between the main course and dessert. I declined Eliza's offer to drive me home. I need to walk, I told her, knowing the night air might help clear my head. I'll be fine. The city streets were nearly empty, the occasional passing car the only disruption to the stillness. I walked without any particular destination, retracing the events of the evening in my mind. The look on Marcus's face when he opened the envelope. Sophia's tears. The Robertsons' hasty departure. Thomas's cold fury. It had gone exactly as I'd planned, and yet now that it was over, I felt strangely hollow. I found myself standing outside. Our home? No, my home now. The lights were off. Marcus hadn't returned yet. Perhaps he never would. I wondered briefly where he would go tonight. To Sophia? To a hotel? I discovered, somewhat to my surprise, that I didn't particularly care. Inside, the house felt different, emptier somehow, though nothing had been removed. I moved through the rooms like a stranger, seeing everything with new eyes. The framed photos of our wedding on the mantel. The collection of cookbooks Marcus had given me over the years, each inscription now tainted with knowledge of his duplicity. The throw pillows we'd selected together for the sofa, arguing good-naturedly about patterns and textures. Our shared history was embedded in every corner of this space, but it no longer felt like mine. Like ours. It was a museum of a relationship that no longer existed, preserved in perfect detail, but devoid of life. I climbed the stairs slowly, fatigue settling into my bones. In the bedroom, I avoided looking at the bed we'd shared and headed straight for the closet, pulling out a small suitcase. I wouldn't stay here tonight. Perhaps not ever again. The thought should have been devastating, but instead, it brought a strange sense of liberation. As I packed a few essentials, my phone buzzed with a text. Sarah. How did it go? Are you okay? Call me if you need anything. My attorney had become something of a friend during the weeks of preparation for this evening. She'd been skeptical of my plan at first. Most people just served divorce papers at the office, Rebecca, but had ultimately supported my need for a more definitive closure. I texted back, It's done. Staying at the Langford tonight. Let's meet. Tomorrow. The Langford was a boutique hotel downtown, close to the restaurant and far from the memories that filled this house. I had already reserved a suite, anticipating that I wouldn't want to return home after the confrontation. As I continued packing, my hand brushed against a leather-bound journal tucked at the back of my nightstand drawer. Marcus's journal, the one he'd started keeping about a year ago, claiming it helped him organize his thoughts for complex projects. I had found it 3 weeks earlier, during my initial investigation, and what I'd read had only confirmed what the photographs had suggested. I opened it now, flipping through pages of his neat, architectural handwriting. Most entries were indeed about work, but scattered throughout were references to Sophia, some coded, others explicit. Plans for meetings, reflections on their time together, justifications for his betrayal. "Are consumed with the restaurant again," one entry read. "Barely saw her this week. S understands the creative drive, the need for connection. With her, I feel seen in a way I haven't in years." And later, "Told R I was in Chicago for the conference. Actually took S to the lake house. Strange being. There with someone else, but also freeing. S loved the sunset from the deck. Said she could see why it's my favorite place. Didn't tell her that R was the one who found it, who insisted we buy it despite the renovation costs." Each entry was another knife twist, another confirmation that the man I'd loved had systematically constructed a separate life without me. But they were also evidence, concrete proof of his infidelity, his misuse of our shared resources, his deliberate deception. I had hesitated to include the journal in the materials I'd given Sarah, feeling it was somehow too personal, too intimate, to become part of the legal record. But now, after facing Marcus and Sophia directly, such concerns seemed naive. This was no longer about protecting what we had. It was about securing what I deserved going forward. I packed the journal along with my clothes, then continued my systematic collection of evidence. Financial records from our home office, emails I'd printed from his account, accessed using the password he'd never bothered to change, credit card, statements showing hotel charges, restaurant bills, jewelry purchases, all carefully highlighted and annotated. This hadn't been a sudden impulse, this gathering of proof. It had been methodical, thorough, a process that had begun the moment. I found the photographs and realized the extent of his betrayal. Each piece of evidence was another brick in the wall I was building between my past life and whatever came next. By the time I finished, it was nearly 2 a.m. I closed the suitcase, took one last look around the bedroom we'd shared for the past 5 years, and headed downstairs. On the kitchen counter, I left my set of house keys and a note with my attorney's contact information. Then I stepped outside, locking the door behind me for what might be the last time. Langford welcomed me with discreet efficiency, the night manager asking no questions as he checked me into my suite. The room was elegant and impersonal, exactly what I needed. I showered, letting the hot water wash away the remnants of the evening, then crawled between sheets that held no memories, no ghost of the man who had shared my bed for 8 years. Sleep came surprisingly easily, deep and dreamless. I woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains, momentarily disoriented before the events of the previous night came flooding back. The dinner, the confrontation, the aftermath. I reached for my phone, finding a dozen missed calls and texts from Eliza, checking that I was all right, from Sarah, confirming our meeting, from Thomas, Marcus's business partner, asking to speak with me privately, and finally, from Marcus himself. His message was brief. "We need to talk. Please. This can't be how it ends." I deleted it without responding, then called room service for coffee. As I waited, I organized the evidence I'd brought with me, preparing for my meeting with Sarah. The divorce proceedings would be straightforward with so much documentation of Marcus's infidelity and financial misconduct. But I wanted to be thorough. I'd worked too hard building my life, my business, to risk losing any part of it to his betrayal. Sarah met me in the hotel's private dining room at 10, dressed in her usual impeccable suit, her expression a careful balance of professional detachment and personal concern. "You look better than I expected," she said as she took the seat across from me. "How are you really doing?" "I'm okay," I replied, surprised to find it wasn't entirely a lie. "Last night was intense, but also cathartic, in a way." She nodded, understanding. "And the confrontation with Marcus and this woman, Sophia? Did you get what you needed from it?" I considered the question carefully. Had I? I'd certainly want answers, certainly. Wanted to see the truth reflected in their faces, to force them to acknowledge what they'd done. But more than that, I'd needed to reclaim my narrative, to transform myself from unwitting victim to active agent in my own story. I think so, I said finally. It wasn't about revenge exactly. It was about taking control back, making them face what they'd done in a way that couldn't be minimized or explained away. From what you've told me about the dinner, I'd say you succeeded. Sarah smiled slightly. Serving divorce papers with dessert was a particularly inspired touch. Culinary theater at its finest, I agreed, a ghost of humor surfacing despite everything. Sarah's expression grew more serious as she glanced at the folder I'd placed on the table. You have additional evidence? I nodded, opening the folder and extracting Marcus's journal. This is the most personal piece. I wasn't sure about including it before, but now, I think it's necessary. She took it carefully, scanning a few pages with professional dispassion. This establishes a timeline of the affair, documents his misuse of joint assets, and clearly shows intent to deceive. It's exactly what we need to strengthen our position. Will the divorce be complicated? I asked, though I already knew the I answer. Sarah had prepared me well over the past weeks. With this level of documentation? No. Michigan is a no-fault state, but adultery and financial misconduct are still relevant factors in property division. The fact that your restaurant predates the marriage helps. It's clearly a separate property. The house might be more complex since you purchased it together, but given the circumstances, I don't anticipate major disputes. She closed the journal and returned it to the folder. Marcus would be wise to settle quickly and quietly. If this goes to court, the evidence you've gathered would be damaging not just personally, but professionally. Those clients who witnessed the reveal last night, the Robertsons, they've already seen enough to raise serious questions about his judgment and integrity. I hadn't considered the professional consequences for Marcus, though Thomas's cold fury had suggested there would be repercussions at the firm. A part of me felt a twinge of guilt. I hadn't set out to destroy his career, but another part, the part still raw with betrayal, couldn't summon much sympathy. He's already trying to contact me, I told Sarah, showing her the text. I want to talk. That's to be expected, she said, unsurprised. The impulsive reaction after being caught is usually to try to minimize, explain, beg for another chance. My advice? Maintain distance. Any communication should go through me for now. What about the house? My clothes? My books? We can arrange for you to collect your personal belongings with a neutral third party present. As for the house itself, that will be part of the property settlement. Would you want to keep it? I shook my head without hesitation. No. Too many memories. I'd prefer to sell it and divide the proceeds. Sarah made a note. That's the simplest approach. We'll include it in our initial settlement proposal. As we continued discussing the practical aspects of disentangling my life from Marcus's, I felt a strange sense of clarity emerging from the emotional fog of the past weeks. This was the next phase, the methodical deconstruction of a shared life, reducing 8 years to assets and liabilities to be divided. There's one more thing, I said as our meeting drew to a close. My name. I want to change it back to Lawson, as soon as possible. Sarah nodded, understanding the significance of the request, reclaiming my identity, shedding the last visible connection to the marriage that had defined me for so long. We can file that paperwork today, she assured me. It's a straightforward process. As I gathered my evidence preparing to leave, Sarah placed a hand on mine, a rare gesture of personal connection from the typically reserved attorney. Rebecca, she said quietly, what you did last night took remarkable courage. Not many people would have the strength to confront betrayal so directly, so completely. Whatever happens next, remember that. Her words stayed with me as I left the hotel, stepping out into a day that somehow seemed brighter, clearer than the one before. The path ahead wasn't certain. Divorce, rebuilding, rediscovering who I was beyond the partnership I'd thought would last a lifetime. But for the first time since finding those photographs, I felt ready to face it. The evidence was gathered. The truth is exposed. Now it was time to begin again. 3 days after the dinner, I returned to Maison for the first time. The restaurant had continued operating without me. Eliza had stepped up as acting head chef, maintaining our standards seamlessly. But I couldn't stay away forever. This place was my creation, my passion, the one part of my life that remained untainted by Marcus's betrayal. Still, walking through those doors felt different now. The staff greeted me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Clearly, rumors had circulated about what had happened in the private dining room that night. I didn't offer explanations. Some boundaries needed to remain intact, even as others had been irrevocably breached. The reviews from last week's service were excellent, Eliza reported as we walked through the kitchen together. That new halibut dish you developed is getting particular attention. I nodded, grateful for her focus on the professional rather than the personal. Any issues with suppliers? Nothing major. That truffle shipment was delayed, but we adjusted the weekend menu. We continued our inspection, discussing menu rotations, staff schedules, the upcoming visit from the health inspector, the normal rhythms of restaurant life that had once been the center of my world. I found comfort in these details, in the precise measurements and timing that cooking demanded. Here, at least, I knew exactly what I was doing. Later, in my small office, I sat alone, staring at the framed review that had launched Maison's success 3 years earlier. The critic had praised my unflinching commitment to authentic flavors and courageous culinary vision. I wondered now if that courage extended beyond the kitchen, into the messy, painful work of rebuilding a life I'd never expected to lead, alone. My phone buzzed. Another text from Marcus. He'd been persistent these past days, his messages evolving from pleas for conversation to increasingly desperate demands for a response. I'd maintained my silence, letting Sarah handle any necessary communication. But his digital presence was a constant reminder of what I'd lost, what I'd discovered, what I'd done in response. This latest message was different. I'm moving the last of my things out of the house tomorrow. Sarah arranged it. If there's anything you want before I go, let me know. It was formal, almost businesslike. A stark contrast to his earlier emotional appeals. Progress, of a sort. Evidence that reality was finally setting in for him as it had for me. I typed a brief reply, the first direct communication since the night of the dinner. Nothing I need. The keys are on the counter. His response came seconds later. I'm sorry, Rebecca, for everything. I know that doesn't change anything. I stared at those words, feeling a complex surge of emotions. Anger, still sharp and bright. Grief for what? We'd lost. A hollow ache where trust had once lived. But beneath it all, something unexpected. A flicker of gratitude that he'd finally acknowledged the truth simply, without excuses or blame. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. That evening, after service, I found myself wandering through downtown, past the familiar landmarks of my married life. The theater where we'd seen our first play together. The park bench where Marcus had first told me he loved me. The coffee shop where we'd spent Sunday mornings in those early years, reading newspapers and planning our future. Each location held memories that now seemed to belong to different people. Two young, hopeful individuals who couldn't have imagined where their path would lead. I felt a growing disconnect between that younger version of myself and the woman I was now, as if the revelation of Marcus's betrayal had created a fissure in my timeline, separating past from present with brutal efficiency. I ended up at the river, leaning against the railing of the pedestrian bridge, watching the water flow beneath me. The city lights reflected on its surface, distorted and beautiful. A visual reminder that even broken things could create something worth seeing. Chef Westbrook? I turned at the sound of my married name, still jarring to hear now that I'd filed to reclaim my own. Thomas Sullivan, Marcus's business partner, stood, a few feet away, his expression uncertain. "Thomas," I acknowledged, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "I live nearby," he explained, gesturing vaguely toward the upscale apartments that lined the riverfront. "Evening walk. Mind if I join you?" I shrugged, not particularly wanting company but lacking the energy to refuse. He moved to stand beside me, maintaining a respectful distance as we both gazed out at the water. "I wanted to thank you," he said, after a moment of silence, "for what you did at the dinner." I glanced at him, startled. "Thank me? For publicly exposing your partner's affair and potentially damaging your firm's relationship with a major client? That seems unexpected," Thomas smiled grimly. "The Robertsons are still with us, actually. They requested a different project. Lead, understandably, but they were impressed with how transparently we handled the fallout." "And how did you handle it?" "Marcus is taking a leave of absence from the firm," he replied carefully. "We're discussing a more permanent arrangement. His judgment issues have caused concerns beyond just the Robertson project." I absorbed this information with mixed feelings. I hadn't set out to damage Marcus's career, but I couldn't pretend to be sorry that his actions were having professional consequences. "That wasn't my intention," I said finally. The dinner was about truth, not revenge. "I know." Thomas turned to face me directly. "That's what made it so powerful. You didn't rage or accuse or make a scene. You simply presented the facts, incontrovertible, and let everyone draw their own conclusions." Put that way, it sounded almost clinical, a dispassionate exercise in truth-telling. But we both knew it had been anything but. The calculated nature of my revelation had been driven by profound pain, by a desperate need to reclaim some measure of control in a situation where I'd been rendered powerless. "How's Sophia?" I asked suddenly, surprising myself with the question. Thomas looked uncomfortable. "I wouldn't know. She's no longer working with the firm." "I see. For what it's worth," he added hesitantly, "I don't think she knew the full extent of the situation. Not that it excuses anything." I nodded, unsure why this information mattered. To me. Perhaps some part of me needed to believe that not everyone involved had been deliberately cruel, that Sophia, too, had been manipulated by Marcus's skilled deceptions. "Rebecca," Thomas said, using my first name now, his tone gentler. "What you're going through, it's unimaginable. If there's anything I can do, professionally or personally—" "Thank you," I replied, touched by the unexpected offer. "But I'm handling it?" "Of course you are." He smiled slightly. "Anyone who could orchestrate that dinner with such precision isn't someone who falls apart easily." His words, meant as a compliment, struck an uncomfortable chord. Was that how people saw me now? The wronged wife who'd executed a flawless revenge? The strong woman who'd exposed her husband's affair with surgical precision? Those narratives weren't entirely wrong, but they missed the depths of what I'd experienced, what I was still working through. After Thomas left, I remained on the bridge, thinking about perceptions and reality, about the stories we tell ourselves and others. I'd crafted a particular story at that dinner, one of betrayal exposed, of dignity maintained in the face of humiliation. But the full truth was messier, more nuanced. What no one had seen were the nights I'd spent crying alone in hotel rooms, the moments of paralyzing doubt about my worth, my judgment, my future, the visceral rage that sometimes overwhelmed me when I remembered how thoroughly I'd been deceived. Those elements didn't fit the narrative of the composed, calculating woman who had served divorce papers alongside chocolate soufflés. Yet both versions were true. I was both broken and resilient, vengeful and just, deeply wounded and determinedly healing. By the time I returned to my hotel room that night, a decision had crystallized in my mind. I couldn't continue living in suspension, caught between my married past and uncertain future. The hotel, while comfortable, was a transitional space, neither fully mine nor truly temporary. I needed to establish something new, something entirely my own. The next morning, I called a real estate agent and scheduled viewings of apartments in a neighborhood across town, far from the house I'd shared with Marcus, but still within reasonable distance of Maison. It was time to put down new roots, to create a space unshadowed by memories of betrayal. Later that day, between apartment viewings, I received a call from Sarah. "Marcus has responded to our settlement proposal," she informed me, her tone neutral. "He's accepted almost all terms without contest." Almost all? He's requesting some specific items from the house, family heirlooms, his personal library, that sort of thing. Nothing unreasonable. And, she hesitated, he's asking about the lake house, our weekend retreat, the small cabin Marcus had inherited from his parents and we'd lovingly renovated together. The place where, according to his journal, he'd taken Sophia while telling me he was at conferences. "What about it?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. "He's offering to buy out your share at above market value. Says he knows how much it means to you, but hopes you'll consider it." I felt a surge of fresh anger at the presumption. How dare he assume he knew what the lake house meant to me now, after he'd tainted it with his affair? Yet beneath the anger was something else, a weary recognition that holding on to the property, even partially, would mean maintaining a connection I was desperate to sever. Tell him yes, I decided. But at current market value, independently assessed, I don't want his guilt money. Sarah sounded surprised. "Are you sure? That place has significant sentimental value, not to mention financial. We could negotiate co-ownership with scheduled usage." "No," I interrupted firmly. "I want a clean break, Sarah. Complete separation. Let him have the lake house and whatever memories he's made there. I'm building something new." There was a brief silence on the line. "All right," she finally agreed. "I'll draft the response today." After we hung up, I stood in the middle of the last apartment I'd viewed. A bright, open space with large windows and a kitchen that, while not as elaborate as the one in my former home, had potential. The building was modern, the neighborhood vibrant with small businesses and restaurants. Nothing here reminded me of Marcus or our shared life. "I'll take it," I told the real estate agent, who looked pleasantly surprised at my decisiveness. As we completed the preliminary paperwork, I felt a weight lifting, not disappearing entirely but shifting, becoming more manageable. This was the decision point I'd been approaching since the night of the dinner. Would I allow Marcus's betrayal to define me going forward, or would I use it as a catalyst for transformation? Standing in what would soon be my new home, I chose the latter. This apartment, unlike the hotel room, wasn't just a temporary shelter from the emotional storm. It was a deliberate step toward rebuilding, a physical manifestation of my refusal to remain trapped in the narrative of the betrayed wife. Tomorrow, I would begin moving my personal belongings from the house Marcus and I had shared. I would select only what truly mattered to me, leaving behind anything tainted by his deception. I would create a new space, filled with objects chosen solely by me, for me. The thought brought a fresh sense of possibility, a flicker of excitement amid the grief and anger that had dominated recent weeks. This crisis had forced me to make decisions I'd never anticipated, to forge a path I hadn't chosen. But moving forward was still my choice, one I was finally ready to embrace fully, without reservation or regret. 2 weeks after signing the lease, on my new apartment, I stood in the empty shell of what had once been my marital home, surveying what remained. Most of the furniture was gone, some taken by Marcus to his new place, some sold, some donated. The walls, stripped of artwork and photographs, bore the faint outlines of frames that had hung there for years, ghostly rectangles slightly brighter than the surrounding paint. I moved through the rooms slowly, performing a final check before the real estate agent arrived for the listing appointment. The house would sell quickly in this market, Sarah had assured me. The proceeds would be divided according to our settlement agreement, providing me with additional capital for whatever came next. A clean, efficient ending to this chapter of my life. And yet, standing in the empty living room, I felt a surprising wave of melancholy wash over me. Not regret for my decisions since discovering the affair. Those remained clear, necessary, right. Rather, a deeper sadness for what had been lost long before I found those photographs. For the genuine love and partnership we had once shared, before it corroded beneath the weight of Marcus's choices. The doorbell interrupted my reflections. Expecting the real estate agent, I was stunned to find Sophia standing on the porch instead. She looked different from the confident professional who had arrived at the dinner with her camera and easy smile. Thinner, perhaps, less polished. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup. She wore jeans and a plain sweater, a far cry from the elegant black dress of that night. "Rebecca," she said, her voice uncertain. "I'm sorry to come unannounced. I saw your car and took a chance you'd be here." For a moment, I considered closing the door in her face. What possible reason could this woman have to seek me out now, weeks after I'd exposed her affair with my husband? What could she hope to accomplish beyond reopening wounds that were just beginning to heal? But curiosity won out over self-protection. "Why are you here, Sophia?" She clasped her hands together, visibly nervous. "I know I have no right to ask for your time, but there are things I need to say to you. In person. Not for Marcus's sake, or even for yours, really. For mine." Against my better judgment, I stepped back, allowing her into the empty house. We stood awkwardly in the barren living room, the space between us charged with unspoken histories. "I'll stand," she said when I gestured toward the single remaining chair. "This won't take long." I nodded, crossing my arms and waiting. Whatever she had come to say, I would listen. And then she would leave, and this unexpected epilogue to our connection would be complete. "First," she began, her voice steadier now, "I want to apologize. Not just for the affair, though of course for that too, but specifically for my part in the dinner. For sitting across from you, pretending I didn't know exactly who you were, while you served food you'd prepared with your own hands. I hadn't expected this particular apology. The dinner had been my orchestration, my trap. I'd assumed Sophia saw herself as a victim of my scheme, not a perpetrator in her own right. "You recognized me immediately," I stated rather than asked. She nodded, a flush of shame coloring her cheeks. "Of course I did. I spent an entire day photographing your wedding. I knew exactly who you were when Marcus suggested the dinner at your restaurant. She trailed off, searching for words. "I convinced myself it was somehow okay, that you must know about us, that you had some arrangement." "An arrangement," I repeated flatly. "It sounds ridiculous now," she admitted. "Delusional even. But I needed to believe it. The alternative was acknowledging I was helping a man betray his wife in the most intimate way possible. A woman whose wedding I had documented, whose joy I had captured on what should have been one of the happiest days of her life. The raw honesty in her voice caught me off guard. I had expected justifications, perhaps even accusations, not this clear-eyed assessment of her own moral failures. "Why tell me this now?" I asked, genuinely curious. "The damage is done. Marcus and I are divorced. You and I will never see each other again after today." Sophia met my gaze directly. "Because you deserve the truth. All of it. And because I need to say it out loud, to you, to have any hope of forgiving myself someday." She took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for what came next. "The second thing I came to tell you is that it's over between Marcus and me. It ended the night of the dinner." This news wasn't entirely surprising. I had suspected their relationship wouldn't survive the public exposure of its origins, but I felt an unexpected twinge of something like sympathy for her. She had lost too, albeit through her own choices. "That's not why I'm here," she added quickly, noticing my expression. "I'm not seeking sympathy or trying to create some bond between us as women he's hurt. What he did to you is incomparable to anything I've experienced." I entered our relationship with open eyes, however clouded by self-deception. I appreciated her clarity on this point. The last thing I wanted was to be cast alongside her as fellow victims of Marcus's charm, as if our experiences were somehow equivalent. "The truth is," she continued, "seeing you that night, your dignity, your strength even in the face of such betrayal, it forced me to confront what I'd become. The person I'd allowed myself to be. Someone who could rationalize participating in the destruction of another woman's marriage." Her words hung in the empty room, raw and unvarnished. I found myself remembering what Marcus had first said about her photography, that she captured real emotions, not just posed smiles. Perhaps that capacity for seeing truth extended beyond her camera work, at least now that self-interest no longer clouded her vision. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Sophia said firmly. "I don't expect it, and I'm not sure I deserve it. But I wanted you to know that what you did that night, as painful and humiliating as it was for all involved, ultimately forced a reckoning. That was necessary, at least for me." I considered her words carefully, searching for hidden agendas or manipulations. Found none. Just a woman trying, however imperfectly, to make sense of her role in a painful situation, to extract some meaning from the wreckage of poor choices. "Thank you for your honesty," I said finally. Not forgiveness, exactly, but acknowledgement of the courage it had taken to come here, to face me directly. She nodded, visibly relieved to have said her piece. "I'm leaving the city," she added. "Taking a job in Seattle. Fresh start." "I hope it works out for you," I replied, surprising myself, with the sincerity of the sentiment. I didn't wish her ill, I realized. She had been wrong, deeply, significantly wrong, but she hadn't been the one who took vows, who promised fidelity and partnership, who built a life with me only to systematically undermine it. As Sophia turned to leave, a final question occurred to me, one I hadn't known I needed answered until this moment. "Did he ever talk about me? During your time together?" She paused at the door, considering the question with care. "Yes," she said finally. "He spoke of you often, actually, with respect, pride in your success. He said no one understood flavor combinations like you did, that your palate was extraordinary." A hollow laugh escaped me. "But not with love." Sophia's expression softened with what might have been pity, or perhaps just recognition of a painful truth. "I think he did love you, Rebecca, in his way. But love, for Marcus, wasn't incompatible with betrayal. That's the part I couldn't reconcile in the end. The ease with which he compartmentalized. How he could speak of you with genuine admiration while simultaneously undermining everything you'd built together. Her insight struck uncomfortably close to the heart of what had been most devastating about Marcus's betrayal. Not just the infidelity itself, but the calculated duplicity that had accompanied it. The way he had maintained our life together while systematically constructing a parallel existence without me. After Sophia left, I remained standing in the empty living room, processing the unexpected encounter. Her visit had forced me to confront aspects of the situation I'd been avoiding, particularly the complex, contradictory nature of Marcus's feelings toward me. The possibility that he had, in his distorted way, continued to care for me even while betraying me so completely. The doorbell rang again, the real estate agent this time, clipboard in hand, ready to discuss listing strategies and market valuations. I shifted mental gears, focusing on the practical matters at hand. The house would go on the market next week. This final physical connection to my marriage would soon belong to someone else, becoming the backdrop for another family's story. Later. That evening, in my new apartment, surrounded by carefully selected belongings that held no painful associations, I poured a glass of wine and finally allowed myself to fully process Sophia's visit. Not just her words, but what they revealed about my own healing journey. 2 months ago, when I'd first discovered Marcus's betrayal, I'd been consumed by pain, shock, rage, emotions so overwhelming they'd threatened to define me. The elaborate dinner I'd orchestrated had been born partly from that maelstrom, a desperate attempt to transform passive suffering into active justice-seeking. But somewhere along the way, between the discovery and today's unexpected confrontation, something had shifted. The raw wounds had begun to scab over. Not healed, not yet, but no longer actively bleeding. Sophia's presence, which one would have triggered fresh anguish, had instead prompted reflection, even a tentative empathy for another flawed human navigating the consequences of her actions. This realization brought with it a new understanding. The dinner had served its purpose, not just as revelation but as catharsis. In exposing Marcus and Sophia's deception to the light, I had released myself from its power over me. The secrecy, the manipulation, the gaslighting, all of it had lost its hold when transformed from private suffering to public truth. There would still be difficult days ahead, moments when grief or anger resurfaced unexpectedly, legal matters to finalize, a holiday season to navigate without the traditions built over 8 years of marriage. But standing in my new space, I felt a growing certainty that I would not merely survive this upheaval, I would eventually thrive despite it, perhaps even because of it. The confrontation that had begun with discovered photographs and culminated in that carefully orchestrated dinner had forced a painful but necessary transformation. I was no longer the woman who had believed unquestioningly in her husband's love and fidelity. But neither was I defined solely by his betrayal. I was becoming someone new, someone shaped by these experiences but not limited by them. Tomorrow, I would return to Maison, to the kitchen that had always been my sanctuary. I would create new dishes, train new staff, perhaps even explore the cookbook concept I'd been considering before the discovery of Marcus's affair had derailed my creative focus. Life would continue, different, but not diminished. And someday, perhaps I would look back on this period not just as an ending, but as a beginning, the painful but necessary prelude to a life more authentically my own than I could have imagined while living in the shadow of betrayal. 3 months after the IRD dinner that had changed everything, I stood in the kitchen of Maison, surveying the controlled chaos of a Friday night service. Tickets lined up on the pass, my team moving with practiced precision as they transformed raw ingredients into the dishes that had earned us our reputation. The familiar rhythm of a busy restaurant, the sizzle of searing meat, the percussive chopping of knives against cutting boards, the calls and responses of kitchen staff, washed over me like a soothing tide. "Fire table 7, I instructed, examining each plate before it left my station. "And tell Eduardo we need that halibut special picked up for 9. Eliza nodded, relaying my commands with the efficiency that had made her invaluable as my chef. We'd found our groove again after the weeks when I'd stepped back from daily operations, allowing her to manage while I dealt with the aftermath of my divorce. Now we worked in tandem, anticipating each other's movements, communicating in the shorthand that develops between chefs who trust one another implicitly. "Chef," one of the servers appeared at the pass, looking hesitant. "There's a food critic at table 12, Marissa Harding from the Metropolitan." I nodded, betraying none of the excitement that flickered through me. Harding was notoriously difficult to impress, her reviews capable of making or breaking a restaurant's reputation. She hadn't visited Maison since our early days, when her cautiously positive assessment had helped put us on the culinary map. A return visit now could elevate us to a new level, if we impressed her. Let's send an amuse-bouche, I decided. The scallop with citrus foam and that new micro-herb blend. As the kitchen pivoted to accommodate this special attention, I felt a familiar surge of creative energy. This was where I belonged, orchestrating flavors and presentations, leading my team toward excellence. The confident certainty of my professional identity had been my anchor during the turbulent months of personal upheaval. The evening progressed smoothly, each table served with precision, each dish executed to my exacting standards. When Harding's entree was ready, a special off-menu preparation I'd developed specifically with critics in mind, I inspected it with particular care before allowing it to leave the kitchen. "Perfect," I pronounced, nodding to the server. "And bring me her reaction when you check on the table." As service began to wind down, I stepped out of the kitchen for a rare moment of visibility in the dining room. I moved between tables, greeting regular customers, asking about their meals, accepting compliments with practiced humility. This part of restaurant ownership had always felt performative to me, a necessary but somewhat artificial extension of my real work in the kitchen. Tonight, though, I found myself genuinely enjoying these brief connections. The lamb was extraordinary, an older gentleman told me, clasping my hand warmly. "We've been coming here since you opened, and it just keeps getting better." "Thank you," I smiled, recognizing him as a longtime patron. "I'll be sure to pass that along to the team." As I made my way back toward the kitchen, I passed table 12, where Marissa Harding sat alone, making notes on her phone between bites of dessert. Our eyes met briefly, and she gave a small nod of acknowledgement, not effusive praise, but, from her, even this subtle recognition was significant. The rest of service passed in a blur of final orders and cleanup procedures. By midnight, the dining room was empty, the kitchen immaculate once more. I gathered my team for our nightly debrief, highlighting successes and addressing the few minor hitches we'd encountered. "Excellent work tonight," I concluded, "especially with Harding's table. Whatever she writes, know that you all performed at the highest level." After they filed out, I remained in the quiet kitchen, savoring the peaceful aftermath of a successful service. This space had always been my sanctuary, but in recent months, it had become something more. A realm where I was fully in control, where my judgment was trusted without question, where my creative vision set the standard for everything that happened around me. The contrast with my marriage couldn't have been starker. With Marcus, I'd believed we were equal partners, only to discover I'd been manipulated, my trust exploited, my perception of our relationship fundamentally flawed. Here, in my kitchen, there was no such deception. Success and failure were measurable, visible, immediate. Relationships were clearly defined. Expectations were explicit. My phone buzzed, interrupting these reflections. A text from Nadia, a fellow chef who owned a Mediterranean restaurant across town. "Heard Harding was at Maison tonight? How'd it go? Still on for brunch tomorrow?" I smiled, typing back. "I think it went well. And yes, for brunch. Looking forward to it." This was another change in recent months, the expansion of my social circle beyond the insular world Marcus and I had inhabited together. I'd begun cultivating friendships with other women in the industry, relationships based on shared professional experiences rather than the couple-centered socializing that had dominated my married life. Nadia had been particularly supportive, having gone through her own divorce several years earlier. "The restaurant saved me," she'd told me over drinks one night. "When everything else felt chaotic, I still knew how to make perfect hummus. Some days that was the only thing I was sure of." I understood exactly what she meant. Cooking had been my constant, the thing I could rely on when every other certainty had crumbled. Not just a career, but a form of self-expression, of control in a world that had suddenly revealed itself to be far less stable than I'd believed. After locking up the restaurant, I drove to my new apartment, a space I now thought of simply as home rather than the new place. I'd finished decorating it the previous weekend, the final touches transforming it from a transitional shelter to a true reflection of myself. Clean lines, bold colors, a kitchen equipped with only tools I actually used rather than the extensive collection of wedding gifts that had cluttered my previous home. The living room walls displayed a series of black and white photographs I'd commissioned from a local artist, close-up images of herbs and spices that were beautiful in their simplicity, revealing complex textures and patterns invisible to the casual observer. Nothing here referenced my past life with Marcus. Everything had been chosen deliberately, thoughtfully, as part of my reclamation of independent identity. As I settled onto the sofa with a glass of wine, I reflected on the day. Not just the successful service and Harding's visit, but the ease I'd felt moving through it all. The absence of the weight that had pressed against my chest in those first weeks after discovering Marcus's betrayal. The growing spans of time when I didn't think about him at all. My phone buzzed again. An email notification this time. I opened it to find a message from a publisher I'd met at a culinary conference the previous month. Dear Chef Lawson, I've been following your work at Maison with great interest and would like to discuss the possibility of a cookbook highlighting your unique approach to fusion cuisine. Your perspective as a female chef navigating the often male-dominated world of fine dining would offer readers something beyond just recipes, a narrative about persistence, creativity, and excellence against challenging odds. If you're interested in exploring this opportunity, I'd love to schedule a meeting at your convenience. I read the email twice, a slow smile spreading across my face. A cookbook had been on my professional bucket list for years, but during my marriage, it had always seemed like a someday project, something to pursue after Marcus's firm was more established, after we'd had children, after some undefined future point when my ambitions wouldn't compete with our shared life. Now, there was no reason to wait. No need to consider how such a project would impact anyone but myself. No requirement to balance my professional advancement against a partner's ego or convenience. The decision was mine alone, as were all decisions in my life now, for better or worse. I typed a quick, enthusiastic response, suggesting several dates for an initial meeting. Then I set my phone aside and leaned back, allowing myself to fully appreciate this moment of possibility. The cookbook proposal wasn't just a professional opportunity, it was tangible evidence of the new life I was building, one unencumbered by deception or compromise. The next morning, I met Nadia for brunch at a small cafe halfway between our respective restaurants. She arrived looking refreshed despite having managed her own Friday night service just hours earlier, a testament to the stamina professional chefs develop out of necessity. So, she said after we'd ordered, her dark eyes alight with curiosity. Tell me everything about Harding's visit. What did you serve? How did she react? Did she say anything to you directly? I laughed, detailing the special menu and Harding's inscrutable expressions. You know how she is, completely poker-faced. But she ate everything, which is more than can be said for her visit to Tableau last month. God, yes, Nadia grimaced. Poor Miguel, she sent back 3 dishes and left halfway through the tasting menu. He's still recovering. Our conversation flowed easily, moving from industry gossip to menu planning for the upcoming season, to the challenges of staff management during the busy summer months. It was refreshing to talk shop with someone who truly understood the peculiar pressures and joys of restaurant ownership, who didn't need explanations or context for the daily triumphs and frustrations. By the way, Nadia said as our food arrived, I have a proposition for you. The Culinary Institute is looking for guest instructors for their summer intensive program. I've done it the past 2 years, but I'm taking some time off in July to visit family in Lebanon. I recommended you as my replacement. I paused, fork halfway to my mouth. Teaching? I've never considered it. You'd be brilliant, she insisted. Your technical skills are impeccable, and you have a way of explaining complex techniques that makes them accessible. The students would benefit enormously from your perspective. I considered the idea. Teaching would require a different skill set than restaurant management, pushing me beyond my comfortable expertise into new territory. It would mean delegating more responsibility to Eliza during the classes, trusting her to maintain Maison standards in my absence. But it would also offer intellectual stimulation, a chance to articulate the culinary philosophy I'd developed over years of professional cooking. "I'm intrigued," I admitted. "Tell me more about the time commitment and what exactly they're looking for." As Nadia outlined the details, I felt a familiar spark of excitement at the prospect of a new challenge. This was what taking back control looked like, not just reclaiming what had been taken from me during my marriage, but actively expanding into new areas of growth and influence, creating opportunities rather than simply responding to circumstances. "I'll do it," I decided. "It sounds like exactly what I need right now." Nadia beamed, raising her coffee cup in a mock toast. "To Chef Lawson, culinary educator extraordinaire," laughed, clinking my cup against hers. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The students might hate me." "Impossible," she declared confidently. "You're too good at what you do. And more importantly, you're authentic. Students respond to that more than anything else." Authentic. The word resonated unexpectedly. For so long, I'd lived adjacent to a fundamental inauthenticity, a marriage that appeared solid while being hollow at its core. Now, rebuilding my life on my own terms, authenticity has become both a guiding principle and a healing practice. Every choice made from genuine desire, rather than obligation or expectation, felt like another step toward wholeness. After brunch, energized by good food and better company, I found myself drawn not to my apartment, but to the farmers' market that operated on Saturdays in the Central Plaza. Walking among the stalls, inhaling the earthy scents of fresh produce and fragrant herbs, I felt a surge of creative inspiration. New dishes began forming in my mind, possibilities sparked by the vibrant colors and textures surrounding me. I purchased armfuls of seasonal vegetables, artisanal cheeses, freshly baked bread, not following any particular recipe or meal plan, but simply responding to what called to me in the moment. This, too, was part of taking back control, allowing spontaneity and joy to guide my choices rather than rigid expectations or external demands. As I drove home with my market treasures, I realized I was humming, a small but significant indication of my state of mind. The road ahead still held challenges, certainly. But for the first time since discovering those damning photographs in Marcus's portfolio, I felt genuinely optimistic about the future. My future, shaped by my own hands, reflecting my own values and ambitions. Taking back control wasn't just about financial independence or professional success. It was about reclaiming my right to define myself, to determine the contours of my own existence without reference to betrayal or loss. It was about choosing, daily, to focus on creation rather than destruction, possibility rather than limitation. The dinner that had exposed Marcus's deception had been just the beginning, a dramatic but necessary first step on a journey that was proving far more rewarding than I could have imagined in those dark initial days of discovery and hurt. I had invited his mistress to dinner to reveal a painful truth. In doing so, I had unwittingly invited myself to a far more important revelation: the discovery of my own resilience, creativity, and capacity for renewal. 6 months to the day after the dinner that had exposed Marcus's betrayal, I received the final divorce decree. The official document arrived in a nondescript envelope, its clinical language transforming the end of an 8-year marriage into a series of legal provisions and property settlements. I sat at my kitchen counter, morning sunlight streaming through the windows of my apartment, and read through each paragraph carefully. The terms were fair, more than fair, actually. Despite having grounds to demand more, I had opted for an equitable division that allowed us both to move forward without the protracted legal battle that so often accompanies high-asset divorces. The house had sold quickly, as predicted, providing each of us with a substantial sum. Marcus had kept the lake house, paying me market value for my share. My restaurant remained solely mine, as it had been from the beginning. His architecture firm, now restructured with Thomas as managing partner and Marcus in a reduced role, continued without my involvement. Clean. Final. Done. I signed my name, Rebecca Lawson, my reclaimed identity now legally recognized, in the Yachi designated spaces, then sealed the document in the return envelope. It would be filed with the court by the end of the week, the last procedural step in dissolving a union that had once seemed unbreakable. I expected to feel something momentous as I placed the envelope in my bag to mail later. Grief, perhaps, or at least a solemn recognition of the significance of this milestone. Instead, I felt a quiet sense of completion, as if the final piece of a complex puzzle had fallen into place. The legal divorce was merely catching up to the emotional separation that had begun the moment I discovered those photographs. My phone chimed with a calendar reminder, 11 a.m., meeting with HarperCollins, Cookbook. I smiled, gathering my portfolio and the sample chapter I'd prepared over the past weeks. The cookbook project had evolved from a tentative possibility to a concrete undertaking, with a signed contract and advance that had exceeded my expectations. Fusion, Traditions Reimagined by Chef Rebecca Lawson, was slated for publication the following fall, featuring not just recipes, but essays on my culinary philosophy and professional journey. As I stepped outside, the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and possibility. I decided to walk the 15 blocks to the publishing house offices, using the time to mentally organize my thoughts for the meeting. The creative direction had been established in our initial discussions, but today we would finalize the photographer, selection, and review the proposed layout for the first chapter. My pace was brisk, energized by anticipation rather than anxiety. This project represented more than just professional advancement. It was tangible evidence of my new independence, my ability to pursue opportunities on my own terms. Halfway to my destination, I passed a familiar figure emerging from a coffee shop, Thomas Sullivan, Marcus's business partner, juggling a cardboard tray of drinks and a briefcase. He spotted me at almost the same moment, his expression registering surprise followed by a genuine smile. "Rebecca," he called, veering toward me. "Good to see you." "Thomas," I nodded, pausing on the sidewalk. "How are you?" "Busy as ever." "Heading to a client presentation." He gestured with the coffee tray. "Liquid courage for the team." I smiled, recognizing the pre-presentation ritual from Marcus's early days at the firm. "The Westford project?" "Finally breaking ground next month," he confirmed. "Actually, I've been meaning to call you. We've commissioned a large-scale installation for the atrium, something culinary-themed to complement the restaurant spaces. I thought you might have recommendations for artists who understand food as more than just pretty imagery." The request surprised me, not just that he would think of me for such a consultation, but that he would reach out at all, given my history with his partner. "I might," I replied cautiously. "A photographer I know does incredible macro work with ingredients, finding unexpected beauty in the ordinary elements of cooking." "That sounds exactly like what we're looking for." Thomas shifted the coffee tray, freeing one hand to reach into his jacket pocket for a business card. "Would you mind sending me their information? And perhaps—" He hesitated. "Would you be willing to consult on the installation?" "Paid, of course. Your perspective would be invaluable." I accepted the card, considering his offer. A year ago, such a request would have seemed natural, the architect husband's firm collaborating with his chef wife. Now, it crossed boundaries that felt both strange and potentially complicated. "I'd need to think about it," I said honestly. "How is Marcus with the idea?" Thomas met my gaze directly. It was his suggestion, actually. This revelation caught me off guard. Really? Thomas nodded. He said no one understands the intersection of food and artistry better than you, that the project would benefit from your expertise. I felt an unexpected pang, not of longing or regret, but of something more complex. Recognition, perhaps, that despite everything that had happened between us, Marcus still respected my professional abilities, still saw value in what I had to offer beyond our broken marriage. "I'll think about it," I repeated more softly, "and I'll send you the photographer's information regardless." "Thank you." Thomas glanced at his watch. "I should go. Client's waiting. But it really is good to see you, Rebecca. You look well?" "I am well," I replied, realizing the truth of it as I spoke. "Better than I expected to be, actually." He smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I'm glad. You deserve that." As we parted ways, I continued toward the publishing house, my thoughts now divided between the upcoming meeting and Thomas's unexpected offer. Working with Marcus's firm, even tangentially, would reopen a connection I'd deliberately severed. Was I ready for that? Did I want it? The question lingered as I arrived at HarperCollins, where my editor greeted me with enthusiasm and immediately launched into discussions about the cookbook's visual aesthetic. For the next 2 hours, I immersed myself in creative decisions, selecting font styles, reviewing photography samples, debating the merits of including personal anecdotes alongside certain recipes. "We want readers to connect with you," my editor insisted. "The recipes are extraordinary, but it's your story that will make this cookbook stand out." "My story?" I echoed, considering which parts of that story belonged in a public document. Certainly my culinary training, my approach to fusion cuisine, my experiences building Maison from concept to successful restaurant. But what about the personal journey that had shaped the past year? The discovery of betrayal, the dinner that had exposed it, the rebuilding that had followed? "Not the divorce specifically," my editor clarified, reading my expression. "But the resilience that brought you to this point. The way food has been both a profession and solace. The philosophy that informs how you create in the kitchen and, by extension, how you've recreated your life." Put that way, it made sense. My personal upheaval has profoundly influenced my cooking over recent months, driving me toward bolder flavors, more ambitious combinations, a fearlessness in breaking conventional rules. The cookbook could reflect this evolution without detailed exposés of Marcus's infidelity or my orchestrated revelation. "I can work with that," I agreed. "A chapter on culinary resilience, how techniques for recovering broken sauces might apply to life beyond the kitchen." My editor's eyes lit up. "Exactly. That's exactly the kind of connection readers will respond to." By the time we concluded the meeting, I felt newly invigorated about the project. This wouldn't just be a collection of recipes, but a creative manifesto, a statement about transformation, adaptation, and the art of beginning again when necessary. Outside, the afternoon had turned gloriously golden, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed for reflection. Instead of heading directly back to my apartment, I detoured to the riverfront park where I'd encountered Thomas months earlier. The water sparkled under the sunlight, leaves in vibrant shades of red and gold drifting across its surface. I found an empty bench and sat, watching the scene with a photographer's eye, noting how light and shadow played across the water, how colors intensified and mellowed depending on the angle of the sun. This awareness of beauty in ordinary moments had been one of the unexpected gifts of the past year. When everything familiar had been stripped away, I'd developed a heightened appreciation for what remained, what could still be discovered. As I sat there, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. The screen displayed a name I hadn't expected to see: Marcus. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. We hadn't spoken directly since the final confrontation after the dinner. All subsequent communication filtered through attorneys and written documents. What could he possibly want now? With the divorce finalized and our lives firmly separated, curiosity won out. I accepted the call. Rebecca. His voice sounded exactly as I remembered. Deep, slightly hesitant, the familiar cadence immediately triggering a cascade of memories I'd thought safely contained. Marcus, I acknowledged, keeping my tone neutral. What do you need? Nothing. He replied quickly. Thomas mentioned he saw you today. Said you're doing well. I am, I confirmed, wondering where this conversation was leading. The divorce papers are signed and ready to file. We're officially done. A pause, filled with the ambient sounds of the park around me and whatever space he occupied on the other end of the line. That's good, he said finally. Clean break. Best for both of us. Another silence stretched between us, loaded with unspoken words. Did you call just to confirm I'm doing well? I asked eventually, when it became clear he wasn't volunteering a specific purpose. No. Yes. I don't know. He sighed, a sound I'd heard countless times during our marriage, usually preceding a difficult conversation. I wanted to tell you that I'm seeing someone. Not Sophia, he added hastily. Someone new. It's recent, but it seems serious. The revelation should have hurt, I supposed. My ex-husband, not yet legally divorced, already in a serious relationship with someone new. But I felt only a mild curiosity, tinged with something close to sympathy for this unknown woman who was stepping into a role I knew so intimately, with all its hidden complexities. Why are you telling me this? I asked, genuinely puzzled. Because... He paused, searching for words. Because despite how things ended, we spent 8 years together. Because I respect you enough to want you to hear it from me, not through mutual connections or social media. Because I'm trying to do things differently this time. More honestly. I considered his explanation, turning it over in my mind for hidden agendas or manipulations. Found none. Just a man attempting, however imperfectly, to handle a delicate situation, with more integrity than he'd shown in the past. I appreciate that, I said finally. And I hope it works out for you, Marcus. I mean that. Thank you. His relief was audible. And Rebecca? Thomas mentioned the Westford installation. I really do think you'd be perfect for the consultant role. There's no ulterior motive there, just professional respect for what you bring to the table. I smiled slightly at his choice of words. I'll consider it. No promises. That's all I ask. Another pause, briefer this time. You really are doing well, aren't you? Not just saying it? The question held genuine concern, reminding me of earlier days in our relationship, before deception and betrayal had corroded what existed between us. For a moment, I glimpsed the Marcus I had fallen in love with. Thoughtful, perceptive, capable of seeing beyond his own interests. I really am, I assured him, surprised by the rush of emotions accompanying this simple truth. Better than well. Actually, I'm thriving. Good, he said softly. You deserve that, after everything. We said our goodbyes shortly after, the conversation concluding as unexpectedly as it had begun. I remained on the bench, watching a pair of ducks navigate the current, considering the strange symmetry of the timing. This call arriving on the very day I'd signed the final divorce papers. It felt like closure, in a way the legal documents hadn't quite achieved. Not forgiveness exactly, the wounds were still too fresh for that, but a kind of acceptance. A recognition that what had happened between us was now truly in the past, allowing both of us to move forward without the weight of unresolved anger or lingering attachment. As the afternoon light began to fade, I stood and continued my walk along the river, my thoughts turning from the conversation with Marcus to the evening ahead. I was hosting a small dinner party at my apartment, not for clients or professional connections, but for new friends. Nadia would be there, along with two other women I'd met through the Culinary Institute's teaching program, and a writer who'd interviewed me for a magazine profile and subsequently become a confidant. This, too, represented a significant change from my married life. Social gatherings then had revolved around Marcus's professional network, couples whose connection to us centered primarily on architecture and business opportunities. Now, I was building relationships based on my own interests and affinities, creating a community that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I had been. At home, I moved through the familiar ritual of dinner preparation with practiced ease. The menu was deliberately intimate, dishes designed for sharing, for prompting, conversation, for creating connections around the table. I chopped and sautéed and seasoned, the rhythmic work of cooking centering me as it always had. By the time my guests arrived, the apartment was filled with enticing aromas and warm lighting, wine breathing on the counter, music playing softly in the background. I welcomed them with genuine pleasure. The awkwardness I'd felt during my first attempts at solo entertaining long since faded. "Something smells amazing," Nadia declared, handing me a bottle of Lebanese wine as she entered. "Please tell me it's that lamb dish you mentioned last week." "With a few variations," I confirmed, accepting the wine with a smile. "I've been experimenting with different spice combinations. Chef Lawson, always innovating," teased May, one of my colleagues from the Culinary Institute. "Save some creativity for the rest of us." The evening unfolded with easy conversation and appreciative responses to each course. We discussed everything from kitchen disasters to dating mishaps to the challenges of navigating traditionally male-dominated professional spaces. I found myself laughing more freely than I had in months, sharing stories I might once have censored, listening with genuine interest to perspectives that expanded my own. "To Rebecca," Nadia proposed as we lingered over dessert, raising her glass. "For reminding us that endings are just opportunities for more spectacular beginnings. And for this incredible meal," added Claire the writer. "I swear you've outdone yourself." I accepted their toast with a smile, warmth spreading through me. That had nothing to do with the wine. This moment, surrounded by women whose friendship had developed during the most challenging period of my life, felt like the culmination of a journey I hadn't known I was undertaking when I arranged that fateful dinner 6 months earlier. Later, after my guests had departed and I was cleaning the kitchen, refusing all offers of help, finding peace in restoring order after creative chaos, I thought about how far I'd come since the night I discovered Marcus's affair. From devastation to calculation to confrontation to rebuilding, each phase necessary in its own way, each contributing to the person I was now becoming. The dinner that had exposed his betrayal had been conceived as an ending, a dramatic final act in a marriage built on deception. Instead, it had become a beginning, forcing me to reconsider not just my relationship with Marcus, but my relationship with myself. Who was I beyond the roles of wife, partner, supporter of someone else's dreams? What did I want, not just professionally, but personally, emotionally, spiritually? These questions, once terrifying in their vastness, now felt like invitations to exploration, rather than demands for immediate answers. The path ahead remained uncertain in its specifics, but the direction was clear. Forward, toward greater authenticity, toward connections built on truth rather than convenience or expectation. As I wiped down the counters and stored the few remaining leftovers, I thought about Thomas's offer to consult on the Westford installation. A year ago, I would have declined immediately, unwilling to risk reopening wounds still fresh from betrayal. Now, I could consider it as simply a professional opportunity, one I might accept or decline based on its own merits rather than its connection to my past. This, perhaps, was the most meaningful measure of how far I'd come, the ability to evaluate potential paths without reference to pain that no longer defined me. Marcus had become a chapter in my story, significant but not determining. The narrative continued, shaped now by my own choices, my own vision, my own understanding of what constituted a life well lived. Outside, the city lights glittered against the darkness, a visual reminder of possibilities waiting to be discovered. I stood at my window for a long moment, taking in the view that had been one of the primary attractions of this apartment. This space I'd chosen for myself, decorated according to my own aesthetic, filled now with memories I'd created independently. The final divorce decree would be filed tomorrow, officially ending the legal bond between Marcus and me. But the emotional separation, the reclaiming of myself as an individual rather than half of a partnership, had been accomplished months ago, through deliberate choices and difficult confrontations and gradual healing. I had invited his mistress to dinner as an act of controlled rage, of righteous exposure. I hadn't anticipated that the same evening would initiate my own liberation, from illusions about my marriage, from dependencies I hadn't recognized, from limitations I had accepted without question. Now, 6 months later, I stood in a home of my own creation, professional opportunities expanding before me, new relationships flourishing around me, looking toward a future limited only by my own imagination and courage. The woman who had orchestrated that revelatory dinner would recognize me, certainly, but might be surprised by how I had evolved since then, becoming not just a survivor of betrayal, but a creator of new possibilities. The dinner had ended a marriage, but it had begun a life, my life, reclaimed and redirected toward horizons I was only beginning to explore. And for that unexpected gift, despite everything, I found myself profoundly grateful. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories, ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.